Piglet and Winnie the Pooh having an early morning conversation in Benjamin Hoff's book, The Tao of Pooh. When you wake up in the morning, Pooh, said Piglet, what's the first thing you say to yourself? What's for breakfast? Said Pooh. What do you say, Piglet? I say, said Piglet, I wonder what's going to happen exciting today. Pooh nodded thoughtfully. It's the same thing, he said. There's a gentle wisdom in Winnie the Pooh. Hoff continues, a basic Taoist principle is that we appreciate life as it is, the sweet with the bitter, that we savor the sweet and we learn from the bitter. Balance. Pooh Bear has that figured out. But if you're like me, you need a little work to get there and a little more work to stay there. To help us work toward Winnie the Pooh's oneness with all that is, Unitarian Universalism draws inspiration from many sources, Taoism being one of them. This pulling from many sources, acknowledging the many corners of human existence from which the truth emerges, is one of our strengths as a faith movement. It is also a potential weakness, leaving us vulnerable to become religious dilettantes, always sampling religious ideas, never delving deeply into them. So today we approach Taoism with humility, ready to be transformed, but acknowledging that there is a level of knowledge which we cannot attain without sustained practice. Religion scholar Jennifer Oldstone Moore demonstrates why this humility is required. She writes, many Taoist texts are written in obscure or coded language to prevent information from falling into the hands of the uninitiated. Adepts were trained by masters who withheld complete teachings until they were convinced that the adepts were worthy to receive them. The final teaching would often be orally transmitted and was the key to the veiled symbolic language that can only be understood by the fully initiated, end quote. There is no substitute for deep and sustained practice of a particular tradition. And yet, Taoism offers such depth that even to explore just the symbol that is used to represent it can be transformative. At the very least, can be an invitation to go deeper. It is especially powerful, I think, for us Westerners. Western philosophy and religion often want to create a simple choice between two opposite things. Often those things are characterized as good or bad. A thing must be all of one or all of another. In Western religion, some Christians talk about being either saved or lost. This is the tradition I came from. Saying a certain prayer can change your status instantly. There's promise of going to heaven, where everything is good all the time, and the threat of hell, where everything is bad all the time. But it's not just religion that does this. Darkness is scary and bad. Some seem to believe in light is calming and good. Socialism is bad and democracy is good, or vice versa. Toys and clothes and all sorts of items and people are deemed either entirely masculine or entirely feminine. In many department stores, there's an aisle for girls' toys and an aisle for boys' toys. But this one or the other thinking isn't borne out in real life, it seems to me. Most of us are like my brothers and me, who had homemade Cabbage Patch dolls driving our dump trucks. It seems that our this or that society leaves little room for gray area. Non-binary thinkers, and certainly those whose gender does not conform to stereotypical binaries, are subject to dire consequences. In contrast to that, Taoism insists on the unity of all things. You can see it in the Yin Yang Symbol. First of all, the symbol is a reminder that darkness and light, or passive and active energy, are not exactly two different things. They're an inseparable whole, always acting together. Taoist teacher Deng Ming Dao writes, the word yin combines the sign for mound or hill with a word that means darkness. The word yang combines that same sign with the word that means sun. Thus we have opposite images of the shadowed and bright sides of a hill. Yin and yang are inseparable. The hill is always both in shadow and in light, and as the sun moves, the proportions of light and shadow shift, but they never part. Without either of those forms of energy, the world would fly apart. Yin is sometimes seen as passive and yang as active. Yin is rest and yang is creativity. Yin is the moon and yang is the sun. One is not good and the other bad. They simply both are. If either of them is taken away, everything ceases to exist. We need them to be acting in concert with one another. If we are all activity and no downtime, we will perish. If only the moon exists and there is no sun, life would not be sustainable. The question is not whether yin or yang is at work in a given situation, but in what proportion are both at work. How much of the hill is in the sun, and how much of the hill is in the shade? It seems to me our lives are like that. We go through seasons. Some are brighter and some are darker, some more restful and some more creative. But as soon as one energy begins to dominate, the other insists on making its way in, as in this symbol, in which it's not a straight line dividing yin and yang, noticed, but a curved one, representing the constant movements and shifts in balance between those two kinds of energy. In fact, in all of nature, that sort of balance can be found. Life and death do not come to us separately. They need one another and are always present together. Death and decay feed life and growth. Day and night, too, form the perfect circle, never on their own. One important implication of the yin-yang interplay for today's world, I think, has to do with gender. I believe this symbol and what it represents invites us to deconstruct the binary gender model, all male or all female and nothing else. For many centuries, some have characterized yin as traditionally female energy and yang as traditionally male energy. But look again at the symbol. In the middle of the female energy is always present male energy, and vice versa, symbolized by the small dots of the one in the other. And not only that, but again, the line that divides them is not a rigid line, but a wavy one, always moving, insisting on motion, here and there emerging and yielding. Ancient Taoism encouraged its practitioners to avoid gender stereotypes. Men were encouraged toward more traditionally feminine tasks and roles and vice versa. Although it was still a product of its time, many more men became priests than women. Taoism was often an escape for women who wanted to live a more independent life than the culture around them allowed for. This ancient symbol reminds us that there is something of the masculine energy of the universe in everyone who identifies as female. And there is something of the feminine energy in everyone who identifies as male. This is old knowledge. This should remind us to honor and respect the many people whose gender is outside the binaries. People who do not identify with either gender in its prototypical form. In fact, I would argue Taoism reminds us that none of us is either purely masculine or purely feminine. There's much more to gender than that. It is much more fluid. More generally, life itself is more complex than the prototypes we construct. It is a fluid balance of yin and yang. One author writes, yin and yang transform each other. Like an undertow in the ocean, every advance is complemented by a retreat, and every rise transforms into a fall. Thus, a seed will sprout from the earth and grow upwards towards the sky, an intrinsically yang movement. Then, when it reaches its full potential height, it will fall. Also, the growth at the top seeks light, while the roots grow in darkness. Khalil Gibran wrote, "Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say no, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your table, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. What then should we do? Knowing that life is a balance of different types of seasons, each with its benefit, each with its unique challenge, how should we behave? For one, this suggests that for the good life, patience is required. The Tao Te Ching says, trying to understand is like straining through muddy water. Have the patience to wait. Be still and allow the mud to settle. Our first reaction may be uninformed. I have regretted my first reactions sometimes. I wonder if some of you have too. It may even, that first reaction, keep us from learning and growing. Patience offers perspective. The shifting balance of yin and yang in our lives requires acceptance, waiting, discernment. It doesn't imply to me that we never act, only that we reflect, make sure we understand as best we can before we do act. I know I've told you this story before, but the best stories need to be repeated. And my family tells me I'm good at repeating stories. It's an old Taoist story about a farmer who had worked the fields for many years. One day his horse ran away. Upon hearing the news, his neighbors came to visit him with cakes and wine. They were so sorry for him. Such bad luck, they said, and they shook their heads. Such bad luck. But the farmer was pretty cool. He said, maybe. The next morning, the horse returned and brought with it 3 other wild horses. Well, now the neighbors wanted to share in the old farmer's joy, so they came around to his house again with more cakes and more wine. How wonderful, they exclaimed, and they sang and they danced all through his house, but the farmer, again, was cool. Maybe, he replied. The following day, his son tried to ride one of the untamed horses, was thrown, and broke his leg. The neighbors, now surely getting tired of their repeated visits to the farmer's house, again came to offer their sympathy on his terrible misfortune. We're so sorry, they said. What bad luck. Well, by now you can probably guess the farmer's response. Cool as a cucumber. Yeah, maybe, he answered. The day after, military officials came to the village to draft young men into the army. Seeing that the son's leg was broken, they passed him by. The neighbors congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out, but the farmer was, again, cool. Maybe. The story could go on for a long time. Its moral, I think, is not to look for the good in every tragedy. To be frank, I get annoyed with that approach. Every cloud does not have a silver lining. Every rose does not have its thorn. What the Taoist master is asking of us is subtly different than that. This story calls us to remember that life will always bring us yin and yang, however we see those. And in fact, the seed of the one is present in the other. Our job is to be carried on by the stream of life in such a way that we do not focus entirely on either what we see as bad or good circumstances. Personally, I see this story as urging us to live lives of gratitude, but a certain kind of gratitude. A gratitude that can be detached from the up and down circumstances of a life that will bring rain and sunshine to all of us. A gratitude that primarily says, I'm grateful to be. At the core of my being, I'm grateful to be, and circumstances will not shake my gratitude. The idea Taoism teaches us is to work with nature as it is. The image of a river is a popular one in this tradition. We can stand in the river of life, discern its movement, be at peace with what we're given, and wait patiently to know just when and how to act. I find myself find it helpful to think of that river as love itself. Where is love flowing? How can I be a part of that flow? I am not at Winnie the Pooh level, But I do think the seasons of our lives invite a deep acceptance of Tao, of the way of things, and the patience and trust in life itself to find just the right way to act to further the good. May we be ever more fully present to the river, just as it is. Amen.